folks. Thanks for tuning in to Food for Thought. On today's episode, we're going to get an inside perspective from one of the largest consulting and design firms in the world, Stantec. Stantec has consulted on numerous large-scale food processing facilities in Canada. Their client roster is strong and contains the likes of Sofina, Cavendish Farms, Frito-Lay, McCain, Labatt, and Nestle, to name a few. Joining us today are Marc Dimanno, building strategist, and Myron Paryniuk, principal. Gentlemen, welcome to Food for Thought, and thanks for being here.
Our pleasure. Thanks for having us.
So let's jump right in. So with Stantec being a strategic partner to many innovative companies in the food processing and technology space in Canada and around the world, can you paint a picture of what you see the future of food looking like from an infrastructure investment point of view?
Yeah, maybe I'll start on this one, Mike. So from the infrastructure investment side, COVID has had a marked impact on the industry, and undoubtedly some of the fallout from COVID will result in some of the food companies that are unable to withstand the low margins and the economic impact from COVID will probably no longer be able to operate. They'll have to cease, and they'll probably be out of business. However, for those that are able to withstand these economic times, I think there's great opportunity for these companies in the areas of things like retooling and redesigning and automation. And more specifically, when you're talking about retooling, it's looking at some investing in some new machinery and some new technology into the equipment, the processors. They were maybe pre-COVID. They were adequate for the time, but with this crisis situation, the requirement is probably going to lend itself to more security and confidence in sanitary processing conditions and processing regimes. So we see an increase in the retooling with machinery. We see an increase in redesigning facilities. And so similar to retooling, the new facilities have to entrench a higher level of sanitation. That means that different types of design of facilities that respect some of the things we're learning about COVID, about how the workplace operates within the facility and how people and workers operate within the facilities, so that the products and the processing can still maintain a standard of assurance. And that standard of assurance will certainly be increased as we're seeing now, and it will continue to increase in time. And lastly, one other aspect about infrastructure investment, we expect there's going to be a significant acceleration in automation. With that, automation essentially will address two primary items. One, there is an aspect of automating that following the capital investment, that there is a cost savings and efficiency improvement with automation. That alone will sponsor a lot of automation. Plus, as well, with the automation, what that will translate into will be, unfortunately, fewer workers on the floor. But what it will mean will be less touches of product, that there will be fewer workers, less workers touching products, and consequently, with less workers touching product, there's going to be less chance of contamination. And again, that's all going to be driven by consumers and retailers, what they want to see in improved product assurance and the product quality and safety. So in some respects, we could be looking at a beginning of almost like a renaissance within the food industry in terms of looking at changes in how they produce and process and what that means from the infrastructure investment side.
Right. Yeah, that's a really interesting point. And I think it's important to note trade-offs come with everything, whether we want to talk about going local and price, or in the case of technology and its effect on jobs, and or the creation of new jobs, or the sort of obsolete nature of some traditional jobs. That's great, Myron. Marc, maybe we can just take a step back and you can provide a little bit of insight on Stantec. I think a lot of people recognize the Stantec name and logo, but they don't necessarily know where your expertise lies.
Thank you very much, Mike.
Yeah, Stantec is a global integrated design firm and engineering firm based out of Edmonton, Alberta. We have over 22,000 people in 400 locations across 6 continents. Over the last 60-some years, we've grown to expand to encompass numerous sectors, including infrastructure, buildings, water, environmental services, and energy and resources. One of the things that we find really interesting about the agriculture space is that each one of our sectors that we currently operate in, each one of our business lines that we operate in, are directly applicable to the agriculture space. And so we see a great opportunity for us in the agriculture market.
Right. And so, it's a pretty unique insight that Stantec has on a lot of sectors, sort of from that 35,000 foot infrastructure investment view. Do you guys have any statistics, or stats that just might surprise the average Canadian about the food they eat, where it's coming from, and the facilities behind producing it?
I guess one of the interesting ones that I've heard over the last little while is, and it's also coming to light that this COVID crisis is a little bit alarming for agriculture in Canada. Over 50% of the food that is consumed by Canadians is not grown on the continent. That alone is quite staggering. And when you think about it, the food that we do typically grow here don't exactly present themselves as being a truly well-balanced diet. So that's one of the things that I find incredibly concerning about this COVID crisis, and a bit of an interesting statistic as well.
Yeah. And one of the things I think I find amazing about the food industry is that how large it is. And it's something that we take for granted. It's kind of like our water supply. We turn on a tap and it just comes out of our tap. In this case, the food industry in Canada is in that $120 billion range, which is a staggering manufacturing sector. It's greater than the auto sector in Canada. And so it represents the largest sector in manufacturing in Canada. And that comprises, they say, in the order of 7,000 to 8,000 facilities in Canada. So again, from small, medium to large facilities, it's a extraordinarily large sector of our economy, employing a number of people. And again, it's just something that every consumer relies on. It's just that things show up at the retailer store, in your restaurant, or whatever it may be. But it's a wonderful commodity, but it's a taken for granted commodity that is essential for our life.
Yeah, those are both really interesting statistics. Myron, earlier on, you mentioned, this is going to change the way that food facilities are designed. And I'm wondering if you can just expand on that a little bit, for these industrial scale facilities that are, truly feeding Canadians. How might you approach it, from a company and design perspective of, eliminating the threat of pathogens and viruses? In the case of COVID, the virus is not actually transmitted by food. It could technically be on the packaging, but, a lot of these big processing plants, there's a lot of KPIs and metrics around, on the processing side, pounds per man hour, or, throughput based on a square footage figure. And so this kind of goes against, the, social distancing, which, hopefully isn't something, forever that we have to be 6 feet away from everyone. We certainly don't want that. But if you've ever been inside these facilities, which I think everyone on this call has, you realize that, there's a lot of people elbow to elbow, which, is very contrary to where we're at right now. So, how might we go about changing the design of these facilities? Or is this a matter of, we're not necessarily going to, fundamentally change them, but how can we safeguard workers?
Right. Great question. And every facility in Canada, in North America, and I suggest probably in the world, is dealing with this at the moment. Because it's no longer, food facilities no longer have to only worry about their product quality and sanitation of their facility, but now they have the third risk of workers, and that becomes extraordinarily difficult now to manage. We're dealing with human beings here, and as you suggest, in close quarters. So just stepping back a little and dealing with pathogens, whether it be COVID or any virus or bacteria, those always exist in every single food plant. It's a question of how good and how well managed each food facility can manage the sanitation to keep these pathogens under control. So that will have to continue with every single plant. That will actually accelerate. There will be a more robust system of sanitation and cleaning for every single food plant. There will be more effective and frequent monitoring of quality standards, sanitation standards. That, from the operational perspective, will be a much more stringent process. From a facility design perspective, what we're seeing already is that viruses like COVID and others, they thrive in, certainly thrive more so in moist environments. So what we're going to see, it will be facilities that have a much higher rate of ventilation, of air movement in the facility, so that it prevents sort of stagnant areas. There are very tight regulations now within the Canadian food industry through the Canadian Food Inspection Agency of how to maintain as clean as possible surfaces, airspace, working conditions. And most companies reach those levels, and some even exceed those levels. And what we'll probably see will be facilities that will probably exceed the regulatory conditions. So right from the processor, from the private sector to regulatory agencies, we're probably going to be looking at a total revamp of regulatory requirements in terms of a increase and an increase of the ways and means that facilities can actually process food. As it relates to workers, we will also see that there will be more separation. We will begin to see the reduction of typical meat plants where workers are side by side and working in close proximity to each other. And that will be accomplished through automation and possibly with new facilities. What you might begin to see will be, rather than having congested processing lines, they'll be expanded, so there will be more separation between workers, just to provide that separation and mitigate that risk of transmission. So we're looking at all those options, and the aspects of ventilation is also being applied in also the workplace and healthcare sectors as well. We're seeing that in terms of understanding that with greater amount of ventilation, that improves the workplace, reduces the level of transmission. So what we're expecting to see in the food processing sector is also going to be applied in other unrelated sectors like healthcare and workplace.
Interesting. Okay. Marc, I'll segue my next question to you. So, there was an article recently in the Financial Post that there was an analyst report that said there's about 23 million square feet of cannabis greenhouse space in Canada, and roughly over 3 million square feet of that is sitting empty. That are greenhouses that primarily were either greenfield at the time or they were brownfield facilities that were growing tomatoes. Cannabis companies came in, put a lot more fancy HVAC systems in, and now a lot of those are sitting empty. Is this an example that we might be able to see some of these facilities be put back into food production, or are there other examples that you know of being able to retrofit some existing facilities to, ultimately enhance Canada's food security?
That's a really interesting question. So although there is a lot of space in cannabis facilities across Canada that's on the market, a lot of these spaces are so highly capitalized that in order to get them to be in a position to be able to grow food and not cannabis, it still requires quite a heavy involvement of investment. And so one of the things that I think is quite interesting is that will these facilities that are currently sitting empty, if they are put up for sale at, say, 5-10 cents on the dollar, maybe that will make sense to convert it. However, it's definitely a numbers game. You have to figure out exactly what that break-even point is. Also, a lot of those spaces that are currently sitting empty that are on the market are not exactly the most well-built facilities. Canada has had a bit of an interesting issue over the last 3-4 years of building these facilities and building them for bottom dollar. trying to be as cheap as possible without the actual equipment in them. And what's resulted is facilities not performing properly, issues with HVAC, issues with flooring and walls. And so I think that it would have to depend on the individual facility. And that's some of the things that we're also seeing in other sectors, is that it really depends on the facility that's there. And so you can look at converting almost anything, but not only a few things will be actually truly viable. One of the structures that I actually think is quite interesting is looking at big box retail and malls. Massive open air facilities where you have the ability for logistics to come in and out, accustomed to going in there with bringing products to stores. Consumers are used to going to those locations, and mall providers can actually provide a really interesting and unique experience for the consumer to attract them to the mall for getting some local fresh produce. So I would say that most things are possible. It's a lot of time and it's a lot of money. It just depends on what makes sense. So over the next few years, I think we're going to start seeing some really interesting conversions of existing spaces into facilities to grow food. I think that some of the big box retail spaces could actually provide that. I read a stat somewhere that said that over 50% of the big box retail stores in the United States are going to be closed within the next 3 to 4 years. So that could possibly service some of that need.
For sure. No, we've seen a few big names in the U.S. Already file for Chapter 11. So, it's interesting you say that. My next question was going to be, do you see any commercial scale, and viability for hydroponic style vertical farms in Canada? And I wouldn't have thought that the answer could have been in that lies in, retail malls. So that's quite interesting. Myron, do you see any, other low hanging fruit in terms of, ways that Canada could increase its food security? I mean, Stantec, you've designed all kinds of infrastructure in various jurisdictions around the world. Are there any, easy wins? I don't know if there's ever really an easy win, but ways that you see or best practices that could be adopted into Canada?
Yeah, no, there absolutely are. You're right. There's never any easy wins. It's a question of having a sort of a global perspective of what's happening in different parts of the world, and it's it's always a two-way street, because there are some wonderful things we're doing in Canada that others in other parts of the world are learning from us. But as it relates to low-hanging fruit and bringing some technology back to Canada in a commercial level, absolutely. One of the things that we're looking at and that's been applied a few years ago is in the area of novel foods, and specifically things like protein. And, there's going to be a net shortage. Already is a shortage of protein on the world market that will be exacerbated in the coming years. So by the year 2025, I think was the time frame, there's going to be a marked shortage. So it's a question of looking at how do you provide protein for the world's masses, and it won't be through conversion of from animal meats. It's going to have to be much more higher efficient conversion. And this actually relates to looking at insects as sources of protein. Insects for human consumption are it's practiced in the good part of the world, just not as much in North America. It's a new novel concept, more so driving from the south of the U.S. Into the north and now into Canada. But several years ago, we began an opportunity to work at a cricket facility in southern United States, and this cricket facility was essentially growing insect crickets, ultimately for protein, for flour, and for snack foods, and it was used as a primary food source. And again, for the unaccustomed, needs to be one's palate needs to be adjusted for that. However, for South American customers and consumers, it's a common food source. So what we've done is we've actually completed that assignment, and we'll apply a similar assignment into Western Canada, where we've actually just completed another insect facility. And in this case, it's being used, the larvae from these insects, and there are literally tons of larvae produced. It's being used as feed material, but ultimately the intent is to be transferred and channeled into the human food consumption area, again, as a protein source. So some really novel applications, but that's some of the examples that we've actually recently encountered in terms of bringing some, if you want to call it low-hanging fruit, into the Canadian marketplace, and fairly significant facilities too, because these are 150,000, 200,000 square foot facilities. So they're not small facilities. They're very expansive. And the market for these products is continuing to grow. So we expect long-term sustainable growth in this area.
One other thing that's really interesting is that I was doing some research on this about a few weeks ago. And in 2018, the market value of edible insects globally was over 400 million US. And that's projected to be about 1.8 billion US, or sorry, 1.18 billion US by 2023. So it's showing that there's continuous demand and a large demand globally that we've not really seen yet in North America. And I think that that'll be coming to the forefront in the next 4 or 5 years.
Yeah. Absolutely. I'm a big believer in the insect, the viability and potential of insect proteins for human consumption. They're obviously being deployed on a large scale basis in the animal feed sector, but I think people, like you said, it's quite a normal thing in certain parts of the world, just not in North America. But I think, with time, I think that'll further adopt in Canada. And that's a great answer. I've asked that question to a few guests we've had on the show. And, we see the same, questions being asked in the energy industry in terms of adding additional refining capacity rather than simply exporting a raw material and then buying it back in the form of, say, gasoline. On the agricultural side, Canada is one of the world's leader in pulse crops, but we don't necessarily refine a lot of those, crops into products. And so that's, where I'm curious as a consumer and just a vested interest and fan of the Canadian food industry of how we can go about capturing more of that value in than exporting a raw material out. And then a lot of that value that's being derived in the food chain is happening in other countries and parts of the world. And then we're buying it back at that premium. I'd really, this is where I'm trying to learn and bring answers for the general public to understand what we can do as a nation to promote greater food security.
Well, I can maybe start on this one, Mike. I think that overall we've noticed that there's been an acceleration of sort of sovereign sort of value-added processing within Canada. Certainly, what's really ignited this aspect was several decades ago was disbanding of the Crow rate, which forced companies either to set up operations in Western Canada or not survive. So that's happened, and especially in relates to Western Canada, we see a proliferation of what used to be primary producing areas, whether it be vegetable, fruit, dairy, or meat. And again, the scenario at that time was produce all those products, ship them to a out of region location to be processed, or possibly out of country to be processed, and then transported back to Canada as a finished product. It's still not at the level where it should be, but it's improved significantly. And we see things like for example, the potato crops in Western Canada, where there is a proliferation of potato processing companies in Western Canada, in Manitoba, in Alberta. The Frito-Lays, the Cavendish Farms, the Simplots, the McCains, employing an awful lot of people. And ironically, a lot of this product gets actually shipped and transported to the U.S. market, where it's as a value-added product already. And there's other examples as well. We talk about the protein market. This is actually intrinsic to the success of certainly Western Canada. Looking at for example, pea protein, that's a rapidly growing industry. And also hemp industry is another great example of what used to be used simply for fiber, for rope, for clothing. Now is a significant industry in Western Canada. Again, those are regional to Western Canada, but those are great examples of how several decades ago those probably would have never existed. But now with the foresight, I guess, perhaps more aggressive nature, and almost the more global retrospective of entrepreneurs looking at global opportunities, it allows them to now produce product from the materials that they just produce, but also process here in Western Canada and throughout Canada.
Let's switch gears to the automation side of, what you guys are seeing in large scale food distribution centers. I'm not sure if Stantec has designed any of them, but you see automation being deployed in all sorts of industries. And that's one of the benefits that Stantec has, is you have such a wide breadth of projects around the world and in different industries. And like you said, Myron, that could come at the expense of, certain jobs or types of labor within some of these companies. But ultimately, do you think that, will help drive further investment into the Canadian food industry?
Yeah, I think on the automation front, it's quite fascinating. I think there's always that big concern of, are we going to lose jobs? But I think a really interesting case study is to look at, there's a factory in Kentucky, I believe it's a Toyota factory, that was previously 100% labor on the assembly lines, building these vehicles. And they ended up reinvesting into it and basically creating fully automated assembly line. There are currently more people that are employed at that facility than there were prior to the time that everybody did, when they had people working on the line full time. But those jobs are a lot more high quality, high paying. There's less risk of injury. The people are more specialized, and they become educated in order to do the job that they take over. So I think it's a really interesting thing where, yes, we'll be losing some of the current jobs that we have, but we'll be paving the way for some more higher value jobs and some more fulfilling jobs potentially. I think a really interesting statistic to look at from automation is that a lot of the companies that are in the space, only 55% are actively investing in automation for their supply chain. And so I think that there's a lot of room to grow in that. There's also massive investment in other things like AI, IoT, cloud logistics, and predictive analytics, among other things, which will then actually be a net benefit to the automation in those facilities. But I think that's one of the things that we see coming is a lot more automation. And I think over the next few years is we also continue to add on the food distribution side directly from a distribution center to the consumer, sort of skipping that bricks and mortar step. There being the need for higher levels of automation in order so that product can be on the same line that goes to either the bricks and mortar location or directly to the consumer. Some interesting statistics that I was reading about in the US. So right now, on average, it takes 66 days to develop a new habit. And so throughout this period of isolation, we're going to be developing a lot of new habits that we didn't have beforehand. Prior to the pandemic in the US, only 3% of grocery purchases were made online. The first week of March, that increased to 11%. It hit 30% by March 15th and 37% the following week. These numbers for April haven't come out yet, but it's not a leap to say that could possibly eclipse 50% during this COVID crisis. And even if we see a retreat back to 10%, that will still be a change of an additional $56 billion in the US alone moving online. And so to be able to take that away from an already thin margin business, how are bricks and mortar retailers going to adapt their existing supply chains in order to take advantage and help supply the market with food if they choose to no longer go to the bricks and mortar location? Automation is one of the only ways that they'll be able to do that.
Absolutely. I mean, even in the last couple of weeks, we've already seen two of the largest food service companies in the world, Cisco and GFS, both come out with direct-to-consumer platforms, which 6 months ago we never would have thought we'd see that in the food service sector. So businesses are definitely pivoting, and like you said, Marc, that there's definitely some interesting habits, let's call them, that will be changing in terms of how consumers purchase their groceries. So I want to be respectful of your guys' time and maybe, give each of you a chance to chime in. But I think, the one theme from this interview that I really liked was what you said earlier, Myron, about, consumers, we turn on the tap for water and we just, expect that it's there. But not many people actually know what goes into, the facilities and the infrastructure that brings that water to our households. I think it's a very similar, notion can be made in the food industry. We just expect that food is on the store at the grocery shelves. And for the first time, people understood what is now going into building a food supply chain. And are those products being imported into Canada? Are they being grown right here in Canada? And which products are higher velocity SKUs in grocery stores that people flock to, in uncertain times? We've seen a lot of things we wouldn't normally see. So I guess, my last sort of question is a little bit open-ended, but for both of you to kind of just chime in on, long-term, what you see in Canada's food sector and just the shifts and the pivots that we're seeing.
Yeah, well, I'll just start on this one, Mike. Certainly, the analogy of taken for granted and the way we have seen our food industry to date, that will be changed. In our view, that will never return to its past. And so we have to be now embracing a new time, some new sort of procedures, and a new way to look at our entire sort of food experience, right from the processing side to the consumer side. Simple things like not expecting to have open displays of fresh fruit and vegetables, so that as we've seen in many retail locations, consumers touch and physically contact that. We're expecting that to go away. Everything will be prepackaged, again, to safeguard the safety and the integrity of food products. So it's going to be an interesting time ahead. We have to be open-minded. We have to store the thoughts of how we used to work around the food industry and modify our approach going forward. So we look at it as with a bit of anxiety, but also with some great opportunity and an opportunity to keep our minds open and learn from others and collectively work together to make our food industry an even better place. And for Canada, it means an even better food distribution and processing and consuming network, because we do have one of the best food networks in the world. We just now are going to make it better. So I'm looking forward to it personally, but with some trepidation.
But thank you very much, Myron. I always appreciate your insight and your thoughts into the agriculture industry. And I think one of the things that I find really interesting is that experience and providing that the consumer with a level of experience. We're so accustomed to going to the grocery store and just seeing bananas there, as Myron analyzed earlier with water and turning on the tap. People probably don't realize that bananas are an asexual fruit and that it's a clone that is produced in order to get onto the shelves here. I don't think anybody's ever looked at the peppers or looked at the strawberries and thought about where that came from and how it got onto that shelf and the simple amazement of the modern day supply chain in order to make that happen. So I think that one of the things that'll be very interesting is the humbling of the consumer. I think that we will start to realize that not everything is instantaneous, like that instantaneous, I can have it now mentality. I think we're going to start to see a bigger interest in where food comes from and what went into that food and who grew that food and who touched it. And I think that what's going to be really interesting is that there's probably going to be people are probably going to be willing to pay more for that experience. And I think this is an amazing time for us, an amazing opportunity. This is the world's greatest equalizer. And I think that we're really going to see a lot of incredible innovation that comes out, particularly in the agriculture industry. One of the things that we always talk about is resiliency. And very rarely have we ever talked about, typically as associated with climate and climate related issues, but not often is it associated with something like a pandemic. And I mean, that goes all the way back to the Spanish flu. There really haven't been any changes on the pandemic side of things for resiliency since then. So I think that there's going to be some significant changes, but I think we have an incredible opportunity to make our world a better place.
Well said. Resiliency and optimism. I think those are two both critical traits that we're all going to need to get through this. So I want to thank both of you guys for coming on Food for Thought. We really appreciate your perspective.
Thank you, Mike. It's been a pleasure.